Hello and welcome to Beginner Beekeeper Survival, the joint class put on by Spencer, Bullitt, and Oldham counties. Day 3. Day 3 traditionally is the longest day of this program and takes place over a 6-hour period. Now, to help break things up and make this not as murderous as it could be, I'll attempt to do these in 45-minute session videos. The day 3 is a doozy. It's the day we cover disease, pests, varroa, and beekeeper interventions. And a lot of this is the stuff you need to understand to be able to react when your hive is in trouble. The first session will just stick with IPM, integrated pest management, what it means, and diseases. I'll aim to have the second session be pest and varroa control and a third session on interventions. And we'll see how we do hitting those 45-minute time marks. I'll go ahead and switch to a shared screen. This is a bit of a murderous presentation for how long it can be. Let me switch this to slideshow view. There we are. Now, who am I? If you saw my video on beekeeping equipment, I've introduced myself once before. I'm Jake Barker. I'm on Facebook as Jake Beeman. I am the Oldham County Beekeepers Educational Coordinator. I'm also a Cornell and EAS Master Beekeeper. I've been keeping bees since 2015. We currently have 100 hives. We might actually try to carry about 70 into winter as of right now. I'm also the chief bee wrangler at Golden Fox Farms. If you see my YouTube channel, it is the beekeeping with Golden Fox Farms format. Now, again, this is day 3 of a normal 3-day program. And in this, we look at disease, pest control, varroa, beekeeper interventions, and resources for you to use as a beginner. Now, the first couple slides are a lot of words and not many pictures. Bear with me as we go through this. On a side note, if you saw my equipment presentation, you might have realized my microphone wasn't actually plugged in. The microphone was being used was the one on the laptop. I'm using my wife's setup and a little alien to me, and we didn't realize I had it hooked up wrong until after recording the first video. But it went well enough, so we're going full speed ahead this time. We'll select the sound quality is just a little bit better with this boom on. Now, integrated pest management. This is an environmentally friendly, common sense approach to controlling pests. It focuses on prevention. If you prevent the pest, you don't need to use the nuclear devices and chemicals and all that stuff to get things back under control in the first place. And we only want to use pesticides as needed. When we look at some of these chemical weapons we have at our disposal, almost all of them have a negative impact on the colony. So we only want to use them if we have to. And one of the things they note here, let me switch to the laser pointer so y'all can see where I'm clicking and pointing at things. We really try to get out of prophylactic applications of pest control because that's how you actually end up really loading these hives with chemicals we don't have to. And also these chemicals ultimately lose efficacy over time. The more we use them, the less useful they become long term. So we need to try to preserve that utility. And that's part of why we have things like the veterinary feed directive, where historically beekeepers would feed medicated syrups to their bees to improve their survival and everything. Well, the downside was we need those medicines to work for us when we get sick. So we don't want to screw up our chances of protecting our own lives with these medicines by over applying them in our livestock situations. So IPM simplified. We make management choices that inhibit pests in the first place. We use monitoring to know when pests are becoming an actionable problem. When do we actually need to do stuff? And lastly, we use targeted interventions to actually deal with these pests. Targeted, limited interventions. When it comes to making management choices that inhibit pests in the first place, we want to provide conditions for health. And with bees, that means a couple of things. They need access to flowers and pollen and nectar. If they don't have that, we need to supplement that using sugar syrups or pollen substitute products. They need a dry hive that will offer protection from the hot and the cold and the rain. We need strong genetic stock. And in this, I mean, including local and resistant genetics. I have a several hour-long presentation on bee genetics. And the reality is not all bees in commercial use have high survival viability. A lot of these stuff that's operated commercially, they're treating them for mites 4 times a year and replacing queens twice a year. And that is a very intensive management. Now they do that because they build fast and they make a lot of bees, which they need to meet pollination contracts and all that stuff like a migratory beekeeper would have. You as a everyday beekeeper or a backyard beekeeper don't need those Ferrari bees. You need Toyota Corolla bees that are easy to maintain. And part of that's getting stock that's been successful in your area from beekeepers that have been successful in your area, and also learning the practices those beekeepers use. Cultural controls based on understanding of pest, parasite, and bee biology. We know where these pests can become problems and how to prevent that. And that's what cultural controls means. And we'll get more into that here later. We also use monitoring to know when pests are becoming troublesome. Are they affecting the colony? Are those levels changing? Is intervention required? Was intervention effective? The most common one I'll see is people are afraid small hive beetles are taking over their colony. They'll see 4 or 5 small hive beetles. Well, at those levels, that's not really impacting the colony. The colony is not going to be bothered by 4 or 5 hive beetles running around. 400 or 500 hive beetles, oh yes, absolutely. And you would definitely need intervention if you're seeing that many hive beetles. Really, I consider anything over 20 is where I start to think I need to intervene. And when we do intervene, was it effective? Does putting beetle traps in those hives actually reduce the amount of beetles in those hives? Or is there something wrong with the hive itself? Does the hive need to be reduced in size so it's better able to police itself? Now, how do we inspect? How do we know if something's wrong with the hive or not? We need to get into the hive, and we need to talk about inspection frequency. I recommend, as a baseline, beekeepers get in their hives every 2 weeks. And that's for a basic inspection. You're going to look for queen right status, food, space, incidental disease, and pest. Okay, what this means is it queen right? Are there eggs? Is there brood? How's the food? Is there a honey band? Is there a nectar band? Is there a pollen band? Is it missing a food source? One of the things to look at is the larva. Are the larvae in milky brood food and swimming around and looking fat and happy, or is it drying out in there? This is commonly a problem we'll actually encounter right in the middle of summertime when the summer dearth hits, or when we have a drought, or we have a dry spell. That nectar will dry up on those bees. And brood rearing is highly dependent on what's coming in the door. Do they have space? We recommend once a hive is using 80% of the frames, add a box. If they run out of space, they're going to swarm, which is a behavior we try to suppress as much as possible. And while you're in there, are you seeing signs of disease, signs of pests? Are you seeing a bunch of hive beetles running around? Are you seeing wax moths? I'll tell you, a strong hive, you should essentially never see a wax moth larva ever inside of it. Said same for small hive beetle larvae, and we'll look at pictures of those later on in this presentation. Now, the every 2 weeks is a seasonally dependent thing. In the wintertime, I just look at them monthly, and by look at them, I mean I'm checking how heavy they are. I'm not even getting into these hives in the wintertime because there's nothing I can do that's going to improve what's going on inside of that hive outside of adding food up top. Now, during the spring, you might need to look more frequently than monthly. In the spring, they can fill a honey super in a week if they're really rocking and rolling. And if that's the case, you might need to keep a closer eye just to watch out for swarming behavior and swarming tendency. I have one beekeeper I know, he actually has a mirror, and he just looks under the hives with screen bottom boards to see if he sees queen cells hanging. Just something to think about. Now, twice a year, you really should do a major on these. And that's, you look at the majority of the frames for issues. This will be in late spring and late summer. Late spring being May. In May, you can do pretty much anything to a beehive and get away with it. And the late summer is your, late August, early September. This is after the flow has restarted and you don't have robbing problems. And that's when we're going to be on the front edge of Varroa problems really hitting, is that early September, late August check-in. We also need to make sure they're going to be healthy enough to go into winter, and that's a big time of year to cull bad queens and combine hives. Lastly, Varroa monitoring. I personally, there's the recommendation, and then there's what I actually do. The recommendation I'll give you is check Varroa loading in late spring, which would be May, after supers come off, which is July. And usually when supers come off is when we go ahead and treat our colonies, because there's a window where there's no honey flow with Apivar or Apigard. After treatment, we want to check again. That'll be in late August or early September. Sometimes these treatment products are not as effective as we expect, and we actually need follow-up treatments, or the colonies can be bombed and have high Varroa numbers after the fact that we need to watch and monitor and control for. Now, targeted interventions. We need to understand chemicals or our big nuclear cultural controls are things we want to use as a last resort when we can, and there's reasons for that. They're costly for starters, and again, they have impacts on the hive. We want to choose the method that has the least risk for bees, humans, and the earth. Years ago, they came out with Checkmite Plus to replace Apistan when Apistan failed for mite control. Checkmite Plus was given emergency authorization because we didn't have a mite control method that worked at the time. But Checkmite Plus is a horrendously toxic chemical that actually impacts a lot of the bees in the hive. It makes drones sterile and is readily absorbed by the comb, so it kind of becomes a persistent poison in the hive. So that's one of those things we really need to reconsider its use. We should only treat when necessary, and that is also before the pests become overwhelming. We want to control those pest populations to below economic thresholds. And what that means is we want to make sure that pest's impact remains relatively insignificant to the colony. And doing this minimizes side effects, losses, and expense. How do we use integrated pest management? Example, at home. Let's say you have ants. The first thing you should do if you have ants is actually remove the food sources. If you don't have food sources, the ants will come in. You seal to prevent entry. If you have holes in windows and doors, get the caulk gun out and fix that stuff. Then we move on to baits and traps. These are limited small areas, so it doesn't impact the greater living space as a whole. Lastly, we use pesticide sprays because sometimes we're just getting outgunned despite using these other tricks of the trade. But pesticide sprays are putting poison all over the living space. And again, something we don't want to do all the time if we don't have to. Now, how do we use integrated pest management in the hive? One example is using hives in good repair with limited openings. That allows bees to police the entrances. Case in point, hive beetles and wax moths. Years ago, they would just drill holes in the supers, big old holes in the supers, to just let the field bees go straight into the supers and they thought it was more efficient that way. And what it really did is it was a boon to wax moths because they could bypass the entrance of all its guard bees and just go to these upper holes that weren't as well defended. So it caused problems for the hives, actually. You want to use bees that exhibit pest-resistant qualities that have hygienic behavior. Some bees welcome and feed hive beetles. You really don't want that if you can avoid that. Certain bees are better at handling pests than others. We're going to use those inspections to monitor those pest levels and make sure they're at acceptable levels. And we use interventions when those pests get above those acceptable levels. Now, looking for trouble. How do we know when a hive is in trouble? Well, we do the inspections and we look for warning signs. A classic warning sign, dead bees or crawling bees. These will be something you see outside of the hive as you approach a hive. You also might see dead or chewed larvae or pupae. Those could be in the frames, those could be in the bottom board, those could be outside the hive as well. It could be the colony is slow to build. One of the recommendations we always give is you should have more than one colony in an apiary, because that way you can cross-reference how it's doing to the other colonies. If one's building slowly, odds are something is wrong with it. And by building slowly, we mean the population's just staying suppressed. And look at the next line, low population. A colony that has few bees in it probably has something going wrong with it. Could be the bees look weird with Varroa, they introduce certain diseases that can cause the bees to be deformed. Case in point, deformed wing virus, where the wings look melted. It also can cause other things like bees in a colony that have parasitic mite syndrome. Their abdomens are short, they're truncated. They look more like a little triangle. That's a sign to look for. Now, admittedly, that's a very bad sign to find, but if you see it, immediate action is required. Spotty brood pattern. This is actually my biggest tell, maybe my second biggest tell. If I see a spotty brood pattern, in general, something's gone wrong with that hive, and I need to seek out what it is. Here's my kitty cat here to show himself off to everyone. Oh, come here, Onslow. It's almost his dinner time, so he's making sure I know about it. Fine, go up there. We can also have mean bees. Colonies that are sick tend to get kind of aggressive, especially with Varroa loading in my experience. So if you have a colony that's getting mean on you, one of the things to maybe have in the back of your head is maybe these bees are sick and actually need treatment. And lastly, if we see the pests themselves, wax moths are pretty apparent when they happen. Small hive beetle is pretty apparent when it happens. Varroa mites aren't. And hi, Kitty. The Varroa mites really require active monitoring to spot them. And when you see Varroa mites, usually you have a pretty huge population already. Now, understanding brood patterns. On the left, we have a fantastic brood pattern. Notice it's mostly intact and uniform. There's not that many holes in it. It's pretty much a solid sheet of brood. On the right, we don't have that going on the right. The right, there's all these holes and all these spaces. Now, I'll tell you, during certain times of year, this might just be going on in the hive. They might have been in starvation mode and shoot things out. These cells might be full of pollen in some hives. This one's not the case. I'll tell you what this one is. This is actually European foul brood. What's going on, we see this cell here that's kind of melted down, and this cell here that's kind of melted down, and this one down here that's kind of melted down. This is a classic presentation of European foul brood where the larvae, the uncapped larvae, end up twisting, deforming, and melting. Now, if you look at the pictures we have later on of European foul brood, it really doesn't look like this. What's going on with this hive, these are very hygienic bees. And once a cell gets sick, they start chewing it out and getting rid of it with the hopes it doesn't infect anything else. And the reality is they're halfway controlling it in this hive, but it's still outgunning them. So just something to be aware of. If you see a spotty pattern, stop and evaluate. There are some hives I have to go 4 or 5 frames before I actually find the sick larva on them, just because they're so hygienic. We want to see nice, intact brood. Now, hygienic behavior. This is something that throws beekeepers for a loop, especially new beekeepers. And they'll see these things staring at it, and it freaks them out. And what this is, if I remember my dates correctly, these are day 13 brood, day 13 larva, or pupa, whatever you want to call it at this point. Day 13 brood, let's call it brood. They have the face of a bee has formed, but the eyes are white, or this one's white. This one's starting to turn pink. This is getting towards day 14 here. There is a behavior the bees are expressing that isn't in your textbooks. And it's this type of hygienic behavior. I call it uncap recap. And what happens is the bee will take this lid off this cell for a day or two, and then they'll put the lid back on. And we were seeing this and wondering what the heck is going on with that. And someone put 2 and 2 together. That bee pupa has a much larger a much larger mass to surface ratio than Varroa mites do. And in the bottom of the cell, there's probably a Varroa foundress mite and her offspring. Well, the offspring, when they're young, don't have hard watertight exoskeletons, and they have a very high surface to mass ratio. Because their surface to mass ratio is so much higher in the Varroa mites than it is in the bee, the Varroa mites desiccate. They dry out a lot faster than the bee does. So when the worker bees uncap this brood, the immature Varroa mites under that cap die, but they salvage the brood and put the lid back on afterwards. kind of a fascinating behavior that we've only seen really in the past couple of years. I should go back. This doesn't mean your hive is dying. It would indicate you need to do a mite wash to find out how high your mite load is. I have some colonies that'll do this while they have well under 2% mite load, and that's how they're controlling that mite load so well. Now, we should go over the diseases of the hive. One moment, I'll take a water break here. And we're going to go from the worst on. We're going to start with American foul brood. And I'm back. American foul brood is the doomsday disease in the beehive. It's called American because it was identified in the Americas first. That's the only reason why it's called American. That is the most dangerous of the bee diseases. It literally requires total destruction of the hive by fire to prevent transmission. The reason why that's the case is this disease is highly contagious, and it creates these spores that kind of impregnate equipment and wax and everything else. And the spores are viable for over 70 years. If you encounter AFB, you must report it to the state apiaries. In the state of Kentucky in 2022, it's Tammy Horn Potter. The young spores end up fed to the larva in the first 3 days. During the first 3 days, the larva has a softer digestive system, so to speak. It's not matured, and the disease can punch through. The older larva is immune to it. Now, that said, once the larva gets inoculated with this, it starts reproducing in the larva's gut. It gets capped by the bees because the bees think this larva is going to grow into a pupa and be good, but it dies under the cap and turns into this brown mucus nightmare. They note a cafe au lait color, you know, kind of gets a coffee, a high cream coffee color, and it just gets goopy. And what will happen with this over time is it just causes the population to collapse. And when the population collapses, eventually the hive gets robbed out and it spreads it on an enormous scale throughout the region. So this is why when you catch this, you want to destroy these colonies before they get robbed out. Now, a couple indicators here that this is AFB and not something else. We see these sunken, kind of greasy cappings. That's a classic sign of it. Brown-black scales. They say scales. I think of them more of scabs. They look like a scab stuck on the bottom of the floor of that thing, and they will not come out. They're pretty much glued in there. A rare sight is a scale with a pupal tongue. Again, that scab on the bottom. And it has this little feature, this little stalactite that reaches up to the top of the cell. There are those field test kits I mentioned in the equipment class. They can use to confirm AFB. You can also use a ropiness test. I think we have an image of the ropiness test here. I lied, we do not. The ropiness test is you can take a matchstick or a toothpick into one of these goopy cells here and spin it up and pull it out like a caramel. If you have a 1-inch rope that holds onto that toothpick, that's positive for AFB. Another test that's more recently figured out is you can take an ultraviolet flashlight. I will put the style flashlight in the comments because I forget what it is off the top of my head. It's like a 600 nanometer or something. And these scales will glow bright green underneath that ultraviolet light. And that's also considered a positive test for AFB. Again, if you see this, we're talking total destruction of the hives by fire. So if it is encountered, and I should note this is rare, but it does occur. We had an incident in Kentucky last year. A few years ago, Tennessee had a major outbreak. And it's also why Tennessee bans the sale of used equipment. Or at least I believe they banned the sale of used equipment. You don't want to spread it to other hives. That's the big thing. If you're in a hive that has AFB, you need to disinfect everything before you touch another hive. This means, you know, your tools, torch them, hit them with a blowtorch, burn the stuff off, wipe your smoker down with bleach, wash your clothes. If your gloves have a lot of propolis on them, toss them. New gloves time. Congratulations. And whatever you do, don't transfer equipment out of that hive. Don't take frames out of that hive and put it in another hive. You're going to readily spread the disease. You need to contact the state apiarist if you suspect AFB. That usually is an interim test by one of those little test kits, the field test kits. Even if it's a positive with that, usually the hive is left in quarantine and a sample is sent to Beltsville. Beltsville is the USDA lab in Beltsville, Maryland, and they have all the advanced beekeeping testing equipment there, and they do an official test there. Once you have a positive comeback from there, you're going to destroy that hive. Now that said, all hives in an apiary need to be inspected with the apiarist if you have AFB. And also we need to attempt to determine where it came from and if it went anywhere. And that is a huge thing. We need to try to determine causality. Where did this come from? Unfortunately, there can be a wild hive in a tree somewhere that died out with it, and that's how you got it. We'll never be able to determine that. But quite often we can determine where it was shipped in from, and that's a very key thing to have in mind. Now, there are no treatments for AFB. Historically, there were treatments used prophylactically, and they would put these products on the hives and would suppress AFB. And when someone else would get those hives, they would stop using those treatments unknowingly, and the AFB would burst out, so to speak. That said, that practice ended in 2017 when the veterinary feed directive came out. With the veterinary feed directive, prophylactic treatments were effectively banned, which also meant you could no longer treat AFB prophylactically. European foul brood. Remember me saying I had that sick frame? It was hard to tell what was going on. This frame's a lot easier to eyeball this disease in. It's called European foul brood because it was first identified in Europe. AFB has an odor. I didn't mention that. AFB smells like, to me, rotting fish, an old tackle box. It just has this smell of death to it. EFB smells more. It has a kind of a sick, rotting odor to it, almost like bad milk smell to it. To me, not everyone gets to smell these smells when they encounter the disease, and only on occasion can I actually smell it in EFB colonies. With EFB, you get young larvae, 2-day-old larvae, get infected by feeding. They ingest some of the disease agent, and they develop a stomach twist, and they turn colors, and they have a tracheal flash. Now, the big thing is to keep from goofballing this up with AFB, is these bees will die before capping. And you see how they kind of get this twist, like, a healthy larva looks more like this. It's filling at the bottom of the cell. These larvae are all twisted on themselves. And here we see almost looks like a skeleton inside that cell. One of the unique tricks of EFB is you develop what's called a tracheal flash, where the trachea, the windpipes in the larva, are readily visible as the larva itself somewhat turns translucent. So it looks kind of like a skeleton. That's the only thing that does that is AFB. AFB fails that rope test, that spin it up with the matchstick test. It won't rope out on you. It does develop those scales, but the scales, or scabs as I think of them, are rubbery and they kind of fall out. You can actually tap them out of the frame. Now, one of the things we used to say is EFB was actually a frame disease. This would classically show up on old brood frames. And if you just threw out those old brood frames, often they probably be fixing the hive. I can't say that's the case anymore. We're seeing more and more persistent foul brood, European foul brood these days. It's just becoming more virulent over time. Let's see what my other slides say about this. Might have to come back. The way you address EFB is you get those old frames out of your system. Some people recommend replacing frames every 5 years. Some people say every 3 years, which I think is absurd. But if you're not migratory and they're not getting hit with weird chemicals and stuff, I think you can get 10 years out of a brood frame. I really do. Now, if you have a friend that's impacted with this disease, if it's more than 10%, get rid of the frame and they'll probably cure a lot of your problems. Historically, we also called it a spring disease. Usually cold, damp weather would exacerbate it and you get more of it. But when you'd have a good nectar flow and things would dry out, you'd usually have the disease correct itself. My cat is moving the monitor. Goofy furball. Now, same warning as before. If you encounter it, don't spread it to other hives. Clean your tools. Don't move equipment from that hive to other hives. There are test kits to confirm it's EFB. It does not have the reporting requirement AFB has. It's not considered as bad. Often mild infections can be dealt with by the bees if you have hygienic bees and good nutrition available. Some beekeepers use powdered sugar on the hive. They'll use it 3 times on every 5 days or so. They'll dust the bees with powdered sugar, and that breaks the feeding cycle up, and it's thought might break the infection cycle in those bees. I haven't had luck with it. I have used oxytetracycline, which is a powder product you'd buy from one of the bee supply shops, and they sell it in enormous bags that are a lifetime supply. But it does require that veterinary feed directive. You have to have a script from a veterinarian to buy it. I've used it a couple times. I've been successful about half the time with it. We do have resistant forms of EFB around that are resistant to oxytetracycline. Now, one of the questions is how long does material remain infectious? And by material, I mean like frames. Unfortunately, we have conflicting reports. Some people in Europe say it could be 6 months, 2 years infectious. Some people here thought it was, in 2 weeks, you're good. We really don't have a straight answer. If I have a colony with EFB, I try to isolate that colony until either the EFB takes care of itself or it's the next spring and it's been dead for a year. That's kind of my point of view with that, and other diseases that I'm not 100% sure what's going on with them. Now, this is that spotty frame we had earlier on. And again, it takes a while to spot this. This is EFB in here. You can see that it's twisted up on itself. It's twisted up on itself and it's kind of melting. Now, a word of warning, people often associate, let me go back 2 slides, a yellow color, this kind of off yellow color is what they associate with EFB. The problem is that's a secondary infection and you're not guaranteed to have them turn yellow. They often do, but it's not guaranteed. And again, with these really, really hygienic bees, they're getting rid of this stuff before the beekeeper can see it. Now realize all these cells are open because this happened in them and they just got rid of it that fast. So just something to be aware of if you have hygienic bees and a really spotty brood pattern. Chalk brood. Chalk brood is something I usually only see it if someone had their bees get chilled. Basically, the bees turn into little mushrooms and they'll turn white and then they'll turn black. And the black on there is the fruiting bodies of the mushroom. Quite literally, they're turned into a mushroom, and the fruiting bodies are the spore carrying aspect of that. Rarely will you see this greatly impact the hive, but it can be significant. Do I have? I don't have it. I've only seen hives killed by this once or twice, and it's because they were chilled significantly beforehand. Again, a fungal infection. Again, same problem with old frames. So getting old frames out of your system can help you out long term. It is a springtime disease. Again, cold and damp, and chilled brood are prone to it. The larvae are ultimately infected through food. Once the cell becomes capped, the larva becomes vegetative and they stop developing and they turn into mushrooms, quite literally mushrooms. And tapping the frames can dislodge the mummies. These are sometimes referred to as mummies, which is nice. Now, again, how to deal with this. Get the old frames out of your system. If you have frames that are highly impacted, more than 10% of the larvae have it, get rid of those frames. Some bee strains are more susceptible, so requeening is a viable option. It will usually go away with good weather and in strong colonies and dry hives with good ventilation. It's one of those classic cases of, cool, damp hives get sick, like cool, damp houses have sick people. Here's one that's altogether different. This is sac brood. This is one of our rare viruses that has a really obvious physical presentation. One moment, I'll have a drink of water. This is also a spring disease. It's also a dearth disease. It shows up when the food is interrupted into a hive. And what happens the bee, the larva, can't do its final pupation. When it comes to the final time that's supposed to molt, it gets stuck in this larval bag, more or less, and it dies in there. It fills with infectious fluid from that virus, and in turn, when the worker bees clear it out, they spread it around. It can impact adults. So even if you're seeing this just in larvae, the adults are being impacted as well. It does cause precocious foragers. That means bees that turn to foraging too early. And while precocious is usually a good thing in humans, it's a bad thing in bees, because a precocious forager isn't spending as much time working in the hive, and they tend to die rather quickly in the field. It can remain infectious for several weeks. And if you look at these really close, this picture doesn't show it. This is actually the shrunken bee head right here at the tip of it. Tammy Horn Potter's Kentucky's apiarist, she refers to these as canoes, these little shapes pointing up, and that's a classic sac brood presentation. If you see sac brood in a textbook, they usually show this thing that's like, it looks like a red balloon. And the reality is the bees are hygienic to the point now they don't get along that far. They usually clear them out after this stage. You just won't see them in that more advanced form. Again, with the other diseases, don't spread it. It usually goes away with good weather, strong colony, good nutrition, ventilation. Classic things we saw with both EFB and chalk brood. Mild infections can be controlled by the bees, but if you're having more than a mild infestation, you're looking at culling frames and requeening. If you have a frame that's particularly impacted by it, get that frame out of there and see if the hive recovers well. If it's persistent, time to talk about requeening. Nosema. Nosema is a fungal infection. There's actually two different origins of Nosema. There's Nosema apis, which is the original one we've dealt with for however many years. It's also known as wet Nosema because it gets expressed with dysentery, or at least was thought to express with dysentery. Unfortunately, it's been largely replaced by Nosema cerenae, which is a more recent import from the West, or I should say the East. It is far more virulent, and you will not see the dysentery with this. Basically, if you have a colony that's weak and you don't know why they're weak, test for Nosema. Unfortunately, testing for Nosema requires a microscope. It can be tested at Beltsville. You can send them a sample. We're going to try to get scopes at Oldham County beekeepers to help us do this in-house. But you actually literally look for little spores in their gut. Basically, the bees just get loaded with the spore and it robs them of their energy and nutrition, and they end up spreading it within the hive. Historically, we used a product called fumagillin to treat it. However, that new form of Nosema actually reacts very poorly to fumagillin, so we actually recommend not using it at this point. So what do you do? Again, work old frames out of your hives. Nosema tends to be associated with bad old frames. Good nutrition can help these colonies power through this stuff, namely protein. So if you have a colony that's kind of looking pretty dinky in the spring, put a pollen patty on. So that helps juice them, get them out of that funk. Now, this is something you're not going to see, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. Dead outs from Nosema can be treated with acetic acid fumigation. This means using a really high, like 90% concentration of acetic acid that creates this acid vapor. I have not seen that done in the States. That's something they do in Canada. It's just out there so you know it exists. 90% acetic acid will take the skin right off of you. It's a very nasty product. Freezing does impact Nosema cerenae spores. So just as a good practice, if you have a colony that dies out, freeze that equipment for a bit, freeze that equipment for a week, and it might drive down those spores and keep you from having a reinfection later on. In a perfect world, we just throw this stuff away. But it's just too dang costly to do that all the time when you have mystery dead outs and stuff. Now, let's see. We're 40 minutes in. How many more viruses do we have? Okay, we're going to be okay. We got this. Let's talk about parasitic mite syndrome. This is something that happens in the latter half of the year, usually when mite populations spike, and that's going to be usually around August. It is often confused for foul brood because this in many respects looks like European foul brood. But usually you're going to have a high mite population with this. And you're going to see some of the same stuff. You're going to see chewed down bees. That's a classic sign of hygienic behavior, and it's a classic sign of parasitic mite syndrome, potentially, is those chewed down bees. You're going to see some just wiped out larvae. You're going to see some just chunks of bee in those cells. This is something that always confuses me when I just see a couple little chunks of bee in a colony of some really spotty brood. And this is going to be your parasitic mite syndrome. There's also some people might call this crud if there's not actually a high mite load. And crud might also be called atypical European foul brood because you get these cells that look like this with this stuff. And unfortunately, with the high-end lab testing equipment we have, they'll pick up European foul brood DNA just about anywhere. So it can kind of get all sorts of different names attached to it. But this, if you see this in August, this is probably parasitic mite syndrome. Do a mite wash, see what your mite loading is. That's probably what direction you need to go in. Deformed wing virus. This is the disease spread by the Varroa mite. And again, it looks like the wings got hot and they melted. This bee actually emerged from the cell looking like this. And if the bee is impacted enough to show it in the wing, she's going to be impacted in other ways we can't see as well. This bee is not going to be productive for this hive. She can't go out and forage. The second she leaves the hive, she is gone. One of the other things that'll happen with these disease colonies is, this has the deformed wings, but also look how much shorter this abdomen is. It's very, very stumped compared to this abdomen that kind of goes out and tapers more. This is another one of those impacts we see from this disease. And this plays into how effective can this be for the colony. You don't have to lose many bees for a colony to start going backwards because they need so many bees just to maintain their status quo. Here's one that took me for a loop this year is paralysis viruses. There are several strains. There's at least 9 different paralysis viruses that I know of. It's probably 16 when I really think about it. And it can express different symptoms. One is K-wing, and this is K-wing here. This is actually double K-wing because it's expressed on both sides. K-wing occurs when the bee can't properly tuck its 2 wings together. And that means this bee is not going to be able to fly effectively. And we had a big K-wing outbreak in spring 2022 up here in the LaGrange area. It was just really hard to get past. Another expression of a paralysis virus are these greasy bees. Now you can have old bees that look this way, they just lose their hair, but these bees also lose their hair. It's just one of those expressions we see with some of the paralysis viruses. We can also see shakers and shamblers. These are bees that just kind of end up rattling around on the entrance of a hive. They just can't figure out what they're doing. Something's wrong with them. It can also just be a low population or a slow to build hive can be how these viruses express. Now I say this, there are some, do I go into them? No, I do not. There are some more virulent paralysis viruses like cerenae, and they can actually wipe out a hive in 48 hours. So if you see a significant sudden death of a colony, it could actually be a virus that caused it. Unfortunately, springtime weather conditions, cold, wet, damp that shoves the bees together in a tight cluster can promote the transmission of these paralysis viruses. And you can have a pretty bad virus season, which is actually what we had this year. It was persistently cold and wet, and we just kept having these bees transfer this disease to each other. Now, this is something I talked about a little bit with the PMS frame. Idiopathic brood disease, you'll see it called, you also see it called snotty brood. This was first described a good, how long ago was that? 94, that's almost 30 years ago at this point, where they found larvae sunken cells, not in seeds, curls, and white. It is not passed around by Varroa. A lot of times we like to blame things on the Varroa mite, and we test for Varroa in these hives when we find we have a low concentration of Varroa. So it's not Varroa instigated. What happens when they actually do the phenotyping of the disease is pretty much all sorts of things, all expressed at once. We really don't know what causes this or why it's happening. And if you have a client that's looking sick, you pretty much disprove parasitic mite syndrome, AFB, and EFB to come to the conclusion that it's idiopathic brood disease or snotty brood or the crud. Unfortunately, there's no known treatment or prevention. It's just one of those things that pops up generally around August. Now, other diseases, you will not encounter these unless you become a queen breeder generally, and that is black queen cell virus. Sometimes those queen cells, it's more or less sac brood for queens, where the queen can't finish pupating and she turns black in her queen cell. This will be something that impacts queen breeders. I myself will encounter and deal with this from time to time. There's also zombies, which is a forward fly parasitism. Basically, the bees get eggs laid in them that chew out their brains and make them fly at streetlights at night. So they're ingested by other predators, and that is part of the forward flies life cycle. I have a ton of forward flies flying around in my yard, and there's probably a correlation between these two going on. And then we're on to other pests. So with that, we will stop this video at this point at 47 minutes, and we'll pick up the next video with pests. How do I do this? Got to figure out my Zoom controls. One moment. There we go. Stop share, stop recording.